Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to talk about code components, its workflow, and how we can create a simple code component and register it inside a Plasmic Studio. So before diving into the code, let's quickly go through the workflow and some basic drawings to understand why do we need code components and how it can improve our productivity. So the basic flow that we're going to be following most of the time while using the Plasmic Studio, or if you are using any other tool just like Figma or something else, then the first step that we need to do as a designer is to design components inside the studio. So the first step is always to design the components, and most of the time it works perfectly fine because the component that we are designing is mostly composed of different HTML elements and it's not a big deal. So the first step is to design those components, and to use them inside our code base we have two approaches. The first one is loader and the second one is code gen. So if you are using either approaches, you would have to actually design the component in the studio and then sync it down or use it inside your code base so that the developer can just import those components and utilize it and add interaction to those components while using them inside their application. So what if you have to design let's say a Google Map component or similar component that is of high complexity just like maps, or any other component, let's say a graphic library, or you have a graph, a bar chart, or some complex graphing utility that you want to actually design inside the studio. So then it can get really complex, and here the best thing about Plasmic Studio is that it provides us with the code components where a developer actually register a component inside the Plasmic Studio. So a developer will register a component from its code base inside the Plasmic Studio. So for graph, let's say a bar chart, then you can use a particular library from npm. You can install that particular library inside your code base, and let's say we are using a graph chart or a bar chart. Then you can, let's say we have a bar chart that's really complex component, it has different properties and all those stuff. So at the top level we will have a graph which have certain properties. So let's say it has the number of bars or the color of the bar, that is particular property, right? And the size, width and height of the bar, that can be another property. So the core idea is that this particular component that we are going to register will have certain properties that we can change or tweak while coding, and during registration process we will be able to expose those properties inside the Plasmic Studio. So inside the Plasmic Studio this component is now available, and the designer can simply drag and drop that particular chart inside the studio, and they can tweak the color and the width and height and any other property that you have exposed right from the side panel or the property sections. So the overall idea is that these developers will register the code components from their code base, and those components are highly complex. Necessarily they will be complex because of their functionality, just like the Google Maps and the graph library I am explaining. You can actually register any kind of a code component into your Plasmic Studio. It's up to you, but the idea is that the developers register them inside Plasmic Studio for designer to use them, so that the designer don't have to spend much of the time inside the complexity of the design and all those process. So that's it from the theoretical part. So after that we will discuss a simple example where we are going to register a code component, and the functionality is that it is using a framer motion to control the opacity of a component using the viewport scroll by offset. So you'll see how it goes and how we can actually register code components inside the Plasmic Studio. So let's quickly go through the existing project and the starter pack that we have at the moment that we will be using to connect with the Plasmic Studio using CodeGen. So at the basic level, we have a simple project in which in the component that we are looking to use as a code component is this one, which actually have a functionality of fade in and fade out effect. So you can see when we scroll down, then the text or this particular element fades in, and upon further scrolling it fades out. So currently the application is set up using a white utility. You can set up it using create React app or any other utility, but the core functionality is that it doesn't include any plasmic.json at the moment, and it is not connected with the Plasmic. So the only thing it has is that inside the app.jsx we have the top component, which is basically rendering the red section, and below that we have a scroll animation component which has some business logic according to the effect that we want, and that is when we scroll down, then based on the viewport scroll position, it identifies the opacity of the component. So it's the business logic, and you can have any kind of effect over here, but the idea is that how can we export this component or register this component into the Plasmic Studio. So for that we actually need to have Plasmic Studio integrated in our project. So first of all we need to have Plasmic CLI installed, and for that we need to go to the CodeGen overview. For this particular purpose, for this particular tutorial, we're going to be using the CodeGen approach. We can do the code component registration in the Plasmic loader as well. So first of all we need to install the Plasmic API CLI, and I have already installed it globally, and you can actually install it at the project level as well. So let's remove the global and add the Plasmic CLI. Plasmic CLI provide us with different commands such as Plasmic auth and Plasmic sync, which we will use to basically sync down the project, and Plasmic watch for listening to the changes in the Plasmic Studio in real time. So that's pretty out of the scope of this particular tutorial, but to execute the Plasmic command we need to have the Plasmic CLI installed in our project. Alright, so it's now done, and the next thing that we need to do is to actually authenticate this particular project with Plasmic. So for that we need to execute the Plasmic auth command. So I'm going to do npx Plasmic auth, and this will open up the Plasmic Studio inside the browser to authenticate my account. So let's authorize our application, and we can now close this tab. And what this will do is it will create a local file inside our local file system for storing the authentication and credentials. So after doing so, this project has now access to the Plasmic Studio, and what we can now do is actually execute the sync command and sync down the Plasmic project. So let's assume we have a sample project, and I have created a new project for this purpose. So let's rename it to code components example, and here we can copy this ID from the URL. This is actually project ID, and let's execute the command npx Plasmic sync -p and project ID. So this will, what is this, npx Plasmic sync -p. So this will sync down all the changes, and before doing that it needs to have a plasmic.json configured in our project. So that's why it's asking some questions from us. So let's go with the defaults. So accept these defaults, and it will require some npm libraries to actually fetch the components. So we can install that. Hit Y for that. So I'm gonna pause the video for now, and once the process is complete, the installation is complete, we'll be back. Alright, so the command is executed successfully, and we now you will see this particular logs, that is syncing image assets, syncing icons, and syncing components, homepage, something like that. So what it does is that it actually sync down this particular project, and this project has only one page, that is home page. So if we go to the components / Plasmic folder, and inside Plasmic it will have the Plasmic generated components, that is Plasmic homepage and Plasmic homepage module.css. Apart from that, we will have the homepage available inside the components directory. So this is the component which is actually rendering this particular page. So the code gen isn't the subject of this particular video, so we will directly go ahead and move to the code components. So for code components to work, we actually need to have a specific URL inside our application, and the default one or the recommended one is Plasmic-host. And to activate the routing functionality, we need to have some kind of router enabled in our application. It's enabled by default in the Next.js using local file-based routing, but we are in a normal React app that is basically created using the white utility, so we need to have the React router installed. So we will install a React router. Yarn add React router DOM. Once the library is installed, we can go ahead to the main.jsx and wrap the app component inside the browser router. So import browser router from React router DOM and wrap the component. After doing so, we can go to the app.jsx, and here we can add our routes. So first of all, let's add the routes. Import it from the React router DOM and also import route. Alright, so let's add a route to render the home page, and here we will provide the element which should be a component. So we want to render this particular content inside the route, so we'll convert this to a component. Let's name it function root page, and here we'll say, or let's create a different directory for pages. So let's create a pages directory inside the source. Here create a root.jsx ifce, and we will use the same element over here. So let's wrap this component inside a fragment, and let's rename it to root page. Let's import the root page inside the app routes. So the root path should actually render the root page, and if you go back to our application, then it should work perfectly fine. What it says, yeah, it should be like this. Refresh the page. Alright, we missed the imports over here, so let's import the top and scroll animation. Perfect. So we now have the same application but with routing enabled. So what we now need to do is add a Plasmic-host route for rendering the Plasmic host page, and which will help us actually register the components inside the Plasmic Studio. So we now need to add the Plasmic host URL into our application. So for that, we need to open up the docs and move to the code gen and setting up an app host section. So here we can see inside the existing repo section, we should go to the plain React section, and here we will add the URL for Plasmic canvas host. So for that, we need to first make sure that you have the Plasmic app host npm package installed in your project. So if you go to the package.json, it's not yet available in our project, so first we need to install that. It's mostly available when we sync down the project, and it's by default installed alongside the React web, but for some reason it is not installed at the moment, so we need to make sure that it is installed. So after doing so, we can go to the pages directory and create a new page. Let's name it Plasmic host.jsx, and here we will render the Plasmic canvas host imported from Plasmic app host, and go back to the app.jsx and add a route for that. So we will add Plasmic-host, keep it exact, and the element that we should render over here is Plasmic host. So yeah, if you go back to our application and go to /Plasmic-host, then it should render this particular UI, and if this particular UI is rendered and no error occurred inside your page, then you are good to go. So the next step is a configuration inside the studio. So we need to copy this particular URL and go to your project, and let's go to the projects. And to open up the settings of your project, you need to click on the three dots and then click on configure project. Here you need to click on the HTTP and paste your link. So remove the HTTP prefix from the copied URL and confirm. So once that is confirmed, you can open up the project again, and it should render your project as normal. If you receive any error at this particular moment, then it means that you have something missing during your configuration or during your host configuration inside your application. So once your project is opened successfully, then we are good to go, and we can now register our component inside the studio. So first of all, we will go to the Plasmic host page, and here we will register our component. So I will register a simple component at first to go through the whole process, and then we will actually register the ScrollingAnimation component from our existing project. So let's create a simple component inside the components folder. Let's name it greetings.jsx, and this component should receive prop called name, and it will say hello name. Alright, so this is a simple component, and we want to register this component into our studio. So go back to the Plasmic host, and here we'll import the register component from Plasmic app host package, and we'll call this function. The first argument that this particular function requires is the name, is the actual component, so we will import that component. And the second argument is an object with different properties. So the first one, we need to give it the import path, and it should be relative to the source directory. So we can say ./source/components/greetings. Alright, so we can also give it a name. So let's name it greetings. This name will appear in the Plasmic Studio. And the third option is the props that we want to expose inside the studio. So whichever prop we exposed over here, it will display inside the studio on the right side, on the right panel. So we can basically change those props inside the studio. So the only prop that we have in the greeting is the name. So we can say we want to expose a name. Its type is string, and let's add a default value of hello Plasmic. So Yeah, this should just work fine. Let's refresh our studio, and you'll see a warning over here when we do this. It says that your component might not work in certain circumstances because we haven't passed the ref or something like that. So you just need to click on this particular guide and copy this script and add it into your index.html. So we can go to index.html and add the script below the script tag. And if you now refresh the studio, then this warning should be gone. Perfect. And we now have the inside the register components and the components tab, we now have the greetings code component available, and we can use it inside our studio. So let's use it over here. And another thing that you would notice is that when we select the code component, then it is not stylable at the moment. That's because we haven't exposed the class name prop. So let's fix that. We can go back to our greetings component, and here we can receive the class name prop, and let's pass it down to the div. So we want to actually style that particular div, the wrapper of the hello name content. So after doing so, we don't need to actually expose the class name during the registration process, because it is automatically exposed. So we only need to provide this particular prop and use it inside our component. So after doing so, if we now refresh our studio, then the greetings component will now be stylable. So let's click on the greetings, and you can now see all of the styling properties are now available. We can change the color, font size, let's change the weight, and we can do all of this stuff. So that's the normal procedure of registering the code components and expose different properties on your component. So let's take another example, that is the actual component that we want to register into our application. So that is the scrolling animation component. So the first thing that we need to identify in this particular component is which prop do we want to expose. So we want to have the business logic being generic, and we should be able to add the fade in and out effect on any of its children. So for that purposes, we need to remove this and convert it into children. So children should be a prop, that is the default prop provided by the React. So every children that we receive from the studio should have this particular effect if it is wrapped in scrolling animation component. So the first element, or the first prop that we want to expose, is the children prop. And yeah, another thing would be the class name to actually style the wrapper component. So we'll remove this particular class name and rename it with and provide it with the destructured class name property. Alright, we can actually control these particular variables by exposing them into the studio, but for now we are good to go. And we now need to import this inside the Plasmic host. So let's register another component, and let's give it a name of scrolling animation. The import path should be /source components /scrolling animation. The props that we want to expose is children, which is of type slot, and let's give it an object of type slot, and we want to provide a default value. So the default value should be of type text, and its value should be this text should fade in and out while scrolling. Alright, so this is the content for the children, the default content, and now we should be good to go. So let's refresh the studio, and the scrolling animation will now be available inside the studio. We will see the caveats and different minor issues that might occur during your registration process. So that's why I have selected this particular component, that is scrolling animation, to basically highlight those particular issues. So if we now go to the components, and inside the code components we have scrolling animation available. So let's use it inside our home page. Let's remove the greetings and we can say scrolling animation. So let's give it the same height that it has before. So let's give it a height of stretch, and let's remove the padding from the root element, and let's center it. And for that we need to have particular layout and center it down. So cool. So we can now, let's change its background as well, over here. Perfect. And let's add another button, so just to make sure that everything is working fine. And we can now duplicate this project any number of times. Let's remove the, alright, it's already removed, so we can just keep the default styling. And what are we missing over here? Or let's change it to 100 VH. Yeah, this work fine. Alright, so if you notice over here inside the preview mode, and the fading effect might not work perfectly, because the logic that we have implemented inside this particular component is based on the viewport scroll, which means that whenever the overall viewport scrolls, then the Y offset will change. But the viewport isn't scrolling. There is a particular div inside the preview mode which is actually scrolling, so that's why the scroll Y offset isn't changing over here. So for that we need to actually sync down the project, and it will perfectly work fine in our actual project, but we might not see the exact result inside the preview mode. So let's sync it down, and not this one, npx plasmic sync-p. Alright, so the changes are now synced down and they are available inside the home page. So let's quickly render our home page inside a particular route. So let's give it a name of home page, and let's import a home page from the components. This is the component provided, and the wrapper component provided by the Plasmic. So we should be able to get the same effect over here. Yeah, you can see the text now fades out and fades in. Perfect. So the actual implementation or the component code component is now registered. The only caveat, or you can say the minor changes, or you might see different behavior inside the preview mode or the actual functionality when it is synced down, just because that the scrolling behavior inside the scroll animation is defined as a viewport scroll. To fix that, you should we should actually use the scroll by progress of the parent div. and this can happen in any kind of project that you are registering in your project. So just make sure that the the logic is consistent inside the preview mode and the actual application. So if you do care about the preview mode, otherwise it's not a big issue, so that's perfectly fine. Alright, cool. So we now have learned the basics of code component registration. If you want to dig deeper into the code components API, then head over to the docs and you will see the code components API. It has a bunch of properties and a lot of stuff. You can actually provide the custom. If you go back to the project, you can actually provide the custom UI for your prop. And yeah, if you go to the scrolling animation, so, or if you go to the greetings, here inside the greetings, the name property is currently string. So if you have exposed a particular prop, let's say integer, or we should actually get integer as an input, you can actually provide a slider component as well. A drop down, any kind of component is now available using the control prop. So there is a lot inside the code components API, and if you want to learn more, or if you have any specific use case that you want to have a particular video on, then please leave a comment down below and let me know. Thank you for watching.